Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Professional Services Vendor Performance Benchmark Review and Outlook webcast, highlighting the results from our recent Professional IT Services Benchmark. My name is Brittany Desmond, and I will be your host for today's session. Over the past few quarters, we've engaged with our readers to bring deeper clarity into the state of the professional services market. We've had good questions and discussions as a result of these events, and we're excited to continue to connect with you as our service practice grows. In the next 30 minutes, analyst Bryan Belanger and senior analyst Ramunas Svarcas will dive into the trends driving the results featured in this quarter's benchmark, followed by Q&A of these trends and how they will affect you. Before I pass this over to Bryan and Ramunas, there are a few logistics I'd like to cover. First, we will be recording today's session and posting it to our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the others we've posted. Second, we'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts on the material we're presenting. Please send any questions or comments through the Q&A or the chat function. Bryan and Ramunas will address them at the end of our presentation. Or if you'd like to set up a client inquiry for more detailed discussion, please reach out directly to Bryan and Ramunas at the end of the webinar to set up that discussion. Third, we'll send out the slides to everyone registered for today's webcast within 24 hours of the conclusion of the webinar. You can also find the slides as well as our thought leadership pieces, other webinars, and commentaries on SlideShare at slideshare.net/TBR_market_insight. And we will also provide the links and contact info at the end of this presentation as well. Now let me introduce analyst Bryan Belanger and senior analyst Ramunas Svarcas from the Professional Services team here at TBR. Bryan is the primary author of our Professional Services Benchmark, and Ramunas has been covering the services market for over 15 years. With their inputs, the Professional Services team has guided countless clients to improve margins and understand new global opportunities to expand their reach. With that, let me hand this over to Ramunas and Bryan.
Thanks, Brittany, and thank you, everyone, for joining us and listening in today. So where I really wanted to start, as we normally do in these presentations, is to just give a high-level overview of what the IT Services Vendor Benchmark actually is, what it does, how we look at the industry, and how it's used. And we really cover on an ongoing basis in the professional services practice about 35 vendors. And that's a number that's continually expanding based on adding new reports to our universe or including new vendors into our coverage for custom work. Whether it's our global delivery study or our cloud study or our management consulting benchmark, that's a number that's always changing. For this specific study, we're looking at about 30 of those vendors, including a diverse mix across the IT services landscape, from the India-centric firms to some of the more multinational players to service-specific or product and hardware-oriented vendors. So really a diverse mix, and we're really looking at this industry from a vendor perspective and trying to aggregate insights from all these vendors, whether from a service line perspective, a geography perspective, vertical perspective, or resource management strategy, and aggregating those insights into an overall trend and pulse of the IT services industry as we see it moving and changing on a quarter-to-quarter basis. So vendor insight, really the key, and that's something we'll be leveraging throughout this presentation as we look at a much thinner slice of the IT services landscape, the consulting and systems integration industry. And so what we see happening in the consulting and systems integration industry is really a march toward what we're calling an inflection point, where near-term performance and pent-up demand at that inflection point aligns with vendor portfolio investments that have been ongoing, releasing a long-term growth opportunity. And we're really looking at it through the lens of what I'm calling the 3 Ps, not to be confused with the marketing Ps, but one is performance, which is what's happening in the market today and what's moving the market and why, and why do we think that's going to change, and what are the underlying drivers that we see sort of bubbling in the waters that are going to drive that change. 2 is the portfolio. So what are vendors doing to address near-term demand and position for long-term? And it's really a story as we see it around emerging technology, and a shift in overall purchasing attitude and purchasing focus from more of a cost-oriented play to one that's really driven by business value. And underpinning that is really the third key we'll be looking at, which is the people aspect. And not only how do you invest in the portfolio, but how do you hire, and where do you strategically place your hiring bets, underlining that shift in portfolio as the consulting and systems integration industry shifts toward a push around emerging technologies. How do you align the people to support that demand and ensure that you are at the table for those large-scale transformational projects that are driven by consulting and systems integration? So with that, we'll start with a discussion of performance, and simply put, the consulting and systems integration industry is currently not doing well. And that's really supported by data from our benchmark. So if we look at total aggregate TTM C&SI revenue for the 30 vendors we cover in the benchmark, that contracted 2.5% year to year in 4Q12, and also decelerated for the fifth consecutive quarter. And this is largely a continuation of trends we've talked about in the benchmark and during these presentations, which is what we termed as the wait-and-see approach in last presentation. And that's really all about customer focus and customer priority. And in the near term, we see that budgets just aren't releasing for those large-scale transformational projects. It's really focused on outsourcing and how can we optimize the business and take cost out. And that's really signaling a shift in spending from consulting and systems integration to outsourcing. And the consulting projects that we do see happening are smaller in nature and smaller in scale as they focus on optimization and consolidation rather than long-term business growth. And that's really what we see as driving performance down in the near term in the industry. So just to broaden that to a view across the four core service lines we cover for the benchmark, this is a slightly different view in that we're showing average TTM C&SI revenue for the 30 firms instead of aggregate, but it's really telling the same story. And we see that for 4Q12, C&SI revenue growth vastly trailed the other service lines we cover, and that's largely driven by the factors at play that I discussed on the prior slide. So just a shift in near-term spending priority away from those longer-term projects as discretionary budgets remain tight, and to focus on BPO engagements that offer near-term value in terms of reducing costs in the business. So at present, just not a broad industry focus on transforming the business through long-term consulting engagements. And so just to look at quickly, who are the vendors that are bucking that trend? If we see consulting and systems integration continuing to contract and continuing to trail the other service lines we cover in the benchmark, who's not following that path? And we've called out here both Genpact and CGI. That's largely a story of bolting on consulting and systems integration revenue via acquisition. What's interesting is the more diverse mix of vendors under those two. So a diverse landscape. We see product and hardware and software oriented vendors growing at rates above peers in the space, as well as a multitude of India-centric firms, largely fueled by their small bases, but as well their low-cost delivery models and ability to leverage low-cost labor to compete at lower price points than some of their more premium competitors such as IBM and some of the MNCs that we don't see on the list. So really two core groupings, the India-centric firms and the product and software-oriented professional services vendors that we see dominating this leader landscape in the benchmark. And we talk a lot during these webinars and in the IT services benchmark about the India-centric firms. And we wanted to look at consulting and systems integration growth through a slightly different lens here, and that's those product-oriented firms I was talking about. In specifically Cisco services. And we see based on the graph here that Cisco's two C&SI segments, its advisory services practice, which is consulting services, and its advanced services practice, which is more implementation and integration services, have both outpaced overall benchmark average consulting and systems integration revenue growth. And there's multiple factors at play there. Certainly Cisco's small revenue base in consulting and systems integration relative to the peers it's competing with are driving some of that growth, just making it easier to grow in the current environment. But there's also other factors we believe more directly linked to the Cisco model, such as its expertise around technology and the differentiation of having that in-house technology expertise and capability relative to maybe some of the India-centric firms or other multinational peers. And that's something in doing custom consulting work for clients that we hear cited as a differentiator for Cisco and in similar firms, is that oftentimes, depending on the strategic nature of a technology implementation project, Cisco and similar firms with that in-house expertise are valued just because they have the in-house differentiation relative to another more vendor-agnostic systems integrator. And then lastly, the channel opportunity, the robust channel allowing Cisco to access new avenues for growth and tap new markets by pushing services through the channel to create new revenue streams.
It's an interesting thing. This is Ramunas Svarcas. So it's interesting to note that Cisco Services has been seeing considerable growth in the marketplace for a number of consecutive quarters. And certainly they have in the past relegated their services growth and much of the services to the channel, but they themselves are also still within, are growing at services. And a key element of that is that Cisco is an innovative company. I mean, they have come out with a number of different products, as well as accompanying services and solutions. They basically announced a whole new series of switches over the last several years. They've entered it into basically the database and the data center market with Blade servers. And more recently, just within the last several weeks, they even announced a new, director for storage to integrate LANs and storage area networks. So they're constantly coming out with new products that demand, is an understanding of how these products fit in, and therefore people are turning to Cisco for assistance from a consulting standpoint, from an advisory standpoint. Cisco's own approach to the overall consulting and systems integration market is to basically do it first ourselves, and then if in fact we can platformize these solutions, we'll turn them over to our channel partners. So they've engaged in a process that has been very successful for them, and it shows from the fact that they've continued to roll out new products and the accompanying services on an ongoing basis now for a number of years.
And the Cisco case is interesting because it's really about portfolio transformation and constantly investing in the portfolio and expanding the portfolio and being able to wrap services around that portfolio to address client needs as they change. And that's not something that's specific to Cisco. That's a major industry trend, and we see it continuing as we reach this inflection point, which means when customer demand for long-term transformational projects around emerging technologies line up with vendors who are investing ahead of the game through acquisitions and alliances and R&D to build those portfolio capabilities. And so it's really, at the end of the day, what we see as a story of needing help. In the near term, customers need help on reducing costs and taking costs out of the business through optimizing existing IT systems and consolidating and standardizing and globalizing those systems. In the long term, as their discretionary budgets improve and proof of concepts with technologies around analytics, mobility, and cloud give way to long-term projects, they're going to have increasingly complex IT ecosystems, expanding data streams, and they're going to going to require help to generate business value from that expanding technology footprint and expanding data footprint to generate business value from those long-term investments, and so they don't get buried under an increasing IT footprint. And that's really the value we see for vendors in this marketplace, is being able to bring strong people and a strong portfolio to the market around those emerging technologies to address that demand and help customers translate an increasingly complex IT ecosystem and mushrooming data into something that's going to help address a business outcome. So just to tee that up slightly differently with a graphic, probably the easiest way to think about this graphic is just in terms of a highway and an on-ramp. If we consider the blue line here, sort of the highway, these are the vendors in their cars already flying down the highway in terms of leveraging acquisitions and alliances to build out the portfolio, investing in vertical expertise to build critical mass around being able to provide consulting and systems integration for these emerging technologies. And then we see the on-ramp, which is C&SI revenue growth and really where the customers are in their cars, recognizing the value and undertaking small pilot projects, but not having the budgets and really deploying that wait-and-see approach we continue to talk about, and not investing in long-term transformational engagements to really transform their IT and business models through the adoption of emerging technology. And so the inflection point is really when they get on that highway and they're both driving full speed ahead together, and demand has aligned with vendors' investments, and that releases a long-term opportunity as they undertake these projects and seek C&SI support to avoid getting buried under those complex IT ecosystems and increasing volumes of data. And so this is really just a slightly expanded version of that highway we're talking about. We see the inflection point where customer demand for harnessing emerging technology as a driver of business value aligns with those vendor investments, and those begin to pay off in the form of C&SI revenue growth. What we really wanted to highlight here is how it's also a collision of a current and a future market scenario where customer perceptions and vendor investments shift and ultimately align around different core goals. In the legacy market, a strong focus on cost and, as I've said before, consolidating and optimizing and really trying to harness efficiencies out of the IT function. And then in the long term, it shifts to a more of a focus on business value and leveraging these emerging technology capabilities, bundling those with industry-specific experts to solve a business problem and address a business goal and create new sources of revenue and take that technology and link it in some way to being able to deliver returns on business. And that's where the consulting and systems integration vendor need comes in to help with that translation. So just to highlight specifically one vendor who we see as sort of speeding ahead on the Ferrari in terms of being on that investment highway is IBM. And we've listed multiple investments here. Few I wanted to call out. First, Mobile First, which is really an aggregation of the end-to-end IBM mobility portfolio into a unified technology and services offering around enterprise mobility. And it's built around 10 acquisitions in mobility that IBM has made since 2006, but the real core differentiation we see in that offering is the IBM services capability. And that's something we see as customers hit that on-ramp and hit the highway and look to adopt comprehensive mobile strategies. They don't only need the technology, but they need the vendor support to ensure that delivers returns and addresses the objectives they need. And so Mobile First, while it's built around IBM technology and there's a strong technology orientation, it's really the consulting and integration and application development capabilities that IBM brings to the table that differentiates that offer and will allow it to grow as large enterprises adopt and seek support with mobile strategy. And then in a similar vein is the commercialization of Watson into vertical specific solutions. This is something that we discussed at length in our IBM HITS report, our Healthcare IT Services report on IBM. And it's really a push around leveraging an ecosystem of really smart people from the healthcare industry, as well as universities and healthcare providers and IBM researchers, and bringing all of them together to create services products around Watson, and taking that really good technology and making it into a service that can be sold not only on a one-off basis, but to multiple healthcare providers to address business pain points and business needs and quality of care needs. So a similar type offering to Mobile First, but with a vertical specific twinge. And those investments and others we see as putting IBM on the right track and in the high-speed lane in terms of investing toward the inflection point.
One of the interesting things about IBM is that, if you look at our early chart here in the presentation, from the revenue growth standpoint, they're not yet getting the revenue that we would anticipate will be coming our way in the future. IBM's done an excellent job. They've always been out ahead of the overall market. They were the first, one of the first entrants into the cloud market. They've developed a portfolio right now of a lot of new solutions. They continue to acquire firms, and they basically are very good at leveraging their acquisitions and integrating them into the overall IBM family, and then rolling it out to the global environment. Small niche firms bring a lot of expertise, but not necessarily a lot of headcount to the puzzle. And we all know that consulting and systems integration is a people business. And then the way you leverage those people and the way you use them is very important as part of the process. Cloud's demanding, people to get involved and to help explain what cloud can do, what can be accomplished. The whole mobility and social environment, we're all talking about people. We're talking about what people are doing with other people, how people are leveraging your products and services. It is in a sense a people business, and IBM has been very good at training their own internal staff, their own people, to sell their products and services and get ready for the next onslaught, uptick of demand. So we really anticipate IBM will be turning the corner from a revenue standpoint. We know from a profitability standpoint that they've been managing their people quite well. Their profits continue to rise, even in spite of the fact that the revenues have slowed in terms of a growth perspective.
And so, no surprise, like IBM, investing in people is really the core base layer to generating value at this inflection point. For IBM, it's investing in people around mobility and investing in people around commercializing Watson. But we really see multiple different investment approaches around building the consulting and systems integration resource footprint as the industry nears this inflection point, and as vendors seek to not only position a portfolio, but have that employee base in position to capitalize on inflection as we hit that point. We really see three dominant investment approaches that vendors are making in their people resources. And one, as I mentioned at the outset with Cisco, is merely building the practice in consulting and systems integration to being able to have that resource to bring to bear to wraparound services, to provide wraparound services for their in-house technology offerings, and being able to compete for those services-led engagements that require implementation and optimization of Cisco technology, and that's something that similar vendors such as EMC are doing as well. Also MNCs, to highlight the IBM example, investing in technology-specific centers of excellence and local delivery centers, really building nerve centers, may it be around a specific technology or a specific vertical industry, to boost their mind share and ability to deliver consulting and systems integration services around Watson or similar analytics or mobility technology. IBM also making multiple other investments, including developing a virtualization center for Wall Street clients and financial services. So similar investments focusing on building these nerve centers of advisory competency to compete as we reach inflection and as demand grows for large-scale transformational projects focused on consulting and systems integration. And then lastly, in the case we'll highlight in more detail, the India-centric vendors and purely building out their on-site consulting and systems integration footprint to not only comply with regulatory change, but to get their foot in the door as we reach inflection and demand shifts to consulting and systems integration. So what we're looking at here looks like a complicated graphic with lots of green and red arrows, but this is really data from our global delivery landscape, and I want to deep dive onto one specific segment, which is onshore headcount. And as we see in the circled region here, this is showing either improvement or deterioration in onshore headcount for 4Q12 versus 4Q11. And we see for the MNCs and the regional systems integrators that all firms except for T-Systems and Accenture reduced onshore headcount year to year in 4Q12, whereas all of the India-centric vendors that we cover in the study expanded onshore headcount year to year. And that's really driven by two factors. One is just to comply with increasingly restrictive regulation as it relates to visas, particularly in the U.S., and no longer being able to rely on landed off-site resources to leverage for consulting and systems integration engagements, and being required to hire locally, both in the U.S. and Europe, just to be able to continue to compete and deliver those services. And then also a more strategic opportunity around providing consulting and systems integration for emerging technologies and for industry-specific transformation as we reach the inflection point. So investing similarly in their onshore capability to sit at the table for those deals. So just to dive a little deeper specifically on the India-centric firms, this graph charts for the global delivery market landscape. It charts India-centric vendor onshore C&SI headcount and growth versus the remaining peers covered in that study. What we really see, looking at the growth line specifically, is an increasingly widening gap in terms of year-to-year onshore C&SI headcount growth. And certainly the India-centric vendors, their small base relative to their more established, more onshore-centric MNC peers is helping nudge that growth above. But we also believe it's a more aggressive pace of investment as they look to build that onshore footprint to be able to compete as the focus shifts from not purely taking out costs through outsourcing, but having services that flavor in front-end consulting and systems integration as they seek to leverage infrastructure management as well as leverage cloud to transform their IT infrastructure in the long term, and requiring an on-site consulting and systems integration footprint to do so.
I just wanted to add here, I mean, it's an interesting little chart here, but one other point that it shows is the fact that you're actually seeing a contraction by the non-India-centric players in onshore headcount, and much of that is occurring, we've seen in the European theater. And we're not just talking about the European-centric firms contracting their headcount in Europe, but we're also seeing virtually all the major multinationals that play in Europe really, contracting their headcount in Europe in anticipation of fairly sluggish growth for the next year or so. So it's an overall trend. It certainly creates an opportunity from a consulting and systems integration standpoint, especially for those that are continuing to stay there, namely the Indian vendors, who are really trying to provide the lowest cost solutions possible for the European theater. So it's an interesting situation. And we're definitely going to be keeping a close eye on it to see if that trend reverses, changes in any which way, shape, or form as economics in the European theater improve. And even Europe itself has areas where we're seeing growth starting to occur again versus other areas where still things are very sluggish. So the overall European theater itself may be moving in two separate directions based on what actual country you're in.
And so lastly, just wanted to provide one level deeper view of the India-centric vendor group specifically, and how are they, as we look at each specific vendor investing in onshore consulting and systems integration headcount. We see that it's mixed, all delivering growth on a year-to-year basis, but Cognizant and HCLT showing decelerating onshore consulting and systems integration headcount growth versus the other three players who are accelerating. And highlighted TCS here as they're the leader in terms of growing their onshore consulting and systems integration headcount, continuing to focus on building onshore centers in the U.S. and recruiting laterals with mobility and analytics expertise. But also wanted to highlight Infosys, who just yesterday actually released or announced rather a partnership with IPsoft, more focused in their infrastructure management business on leveraging IT automation to improve efficiency of infrastructure management service delivery. And talking with them yesterday around that partnership and the opportunity that they see, really one of the focus areas is to not necessarily move away from the infrastructure management space, but to optimize resource leverage in that space so they can bring a greater breadth of services to clients for similar value and similar price points as they're providing before. So if reducing resource for more routine IT service desk and other infrastructure management tasks allows them to focus hiring and redeploy resources to provide consulting and systems integration around analytics and mobility and cloud, then that allows them to bring a more cohesive, more compelling, high-value breadth of services to bear in engagements. And that's something they're looking to through partnerships, as well as all these firms pursuing alternative investment avenues to be able to move up the stack in consulting and systems integration, particularly as we near the inflection point. So just to summarize quickly and cleanly the opportunity we see in the consulting and systems integration marketplace, and it's really encapsulated by vendors being able to live at the gray arrow we see on this slide. And it's the ability to, as discretionary spend recovers, and as clients increasingly spend on large-scale projects to adopt emerging technologies to transform their business, they're going to, as we mentioned before, need help as they get buried and they apply an analytics solution and have to deal with an increasingly complex stream of data and throw their hands up and say, help, what are we talking about here? And the real opportunity is for consulting and systems integration providers to be able to blend technology expertise with industry-specific expertise and functional expertise to translate this data and translate this IT footprint into a business strategy and link it to a business outcome that's going to yield results, whether it's in the term of accelerated product service innovation or accessing new markets as a means of growing revenue. So that translational opportunity is really what we mean by the inflection point, having the capability to not only manage IT, but to layer business value onto emerging technology adoption via consulting and systems integration. So lastly, just to summarize some of the key themes we'll be looking at as we move through the 1Q13 iteration of the IT services vendor benchmark. We'll continue to look at healthcare, and we talked a little bit about healthcare today with IBM's ongoing attempt to commercialize Watson for for the healthcare IT services industry, and that's more of a long-term focus. And how are other vendors investing in their healthcare IT services portfolios? IBM, as we mentioned, is doing a lot around alliances with both healthcare providers and universities to get walked into that point of a standardized portfolio offering. How are competing vendors making similar investments, and where are they hiring strategically? What are the people moves they're making to address growth opportunities in healthcare? We also talked at length about global delivery strategy today and the underlying people investment supporting consulting and systems integration expansion in the long term. A blend of purely hiring on-site or acquiring on-site versus building nerve centers on-site through hiring industry experts. Are those strategies continuing, and how are vendors making those investments? And how is it occurring not only in consulting and systems integration, but in the remaining industry landscape across industries? And then lastly, we'll look at applications outsourcing, and more specifically, how software as a service is impacting that marketplace, and how applications outsourcing is performing, and where SaaS fits, and what are the investments that vendors are making, and how are they investing to expand their software as a service portfolios, and really what is the focus around that market as SaaS adoption grows and continues to cannibalize AO revenues, and where does it fit with the overall cloud strategy?
I also wanted to add here, software as a service really is looking at it as, subscription-based software. It's a renewable stream. It's basically money coming in on a subscription basis. If you look at what, typical services have been historically, consulting, systems integration, applications outsourcing, you were basically working on a specific project for a period of time, and then upgrading it or renewing it or building out better, which was generating services revenues. Well, 10, 15 years down the road, if everything is being run, as a service, those activities no longer really come into play unless there's customization going on. So we're seeing a lot of vendors looking at software as a service as a new revenue stream, looking at something that they can offer on a subscription basis to continue to generate revenues for their organizations. And it's not just software, but also some of them understandably are looking at platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, or some have even coined the term everything as a service. So it's coming down the road, and we're certainly keeping our eyes open, and we're going to start looking at it more closely in our coverage on an ongoing basis.
And with that, we'll pass over to Brittany, who will open it up for questions.
Great, thank you. So we've had a number of questions that have come in during the presentation, so let's jump right in. First, we have on slide 19, there was a question about the red and green arrows. Can you explain what those mean?
Sure, I can handle that pretty quickly here. The green arrows, green being good, red being bad. And the direction of the arrows is really the direction of the trend. And an up arrow means things are growing, getting better, improving. But when you talk about attrition, you want to look at something, attrition to contract. So a downward pointing arrow is a good thing. Attrition is contracting, therefore it's good. And the same token, utilization, if utilization improves, that's a positive, and therefore it's a good thing. If utilization is declining, it's a negative thing, and it's going down. So the reds imply that the things are moving in the wrong direction for the respective firms in this chart here. The green means that they're moving in a positive direction, and it's really kind of an assessment of the direction of where things, were going from where we did this global delivery study, and trying to assess, what is its impact, how is it also playing out in terms of, you kind of all the arrows going up and down. Should their margins be going up or down as a result of them, or they're not? And we saw also that there are other extraneous factors that also impact companies' performance besides just headcount and global delivery, but it certainly has a key element as part of the cost equation.
Thank you. On to our next question. Will you be doing a report on MFG Industry?
as part of our professional services practice, we haven't started really focusing in on specific industries at the present time. We are and may consider as one of our presentations in the coming year, maybe look at some industry verticals in terms of, comparing, contrasting how they're performing with everything that's happening in the IT services space. It's certainly an area that there is a lot of interest. And we do have, several other ongoing reports that, already are industry specific, since we do have a public health, public benchmark and a public benchmark webinar that's already being put out, as well as healthcare, the health, IT services benchmark. So those are already available, and while we have not yet gotten into the manufacturing, we're planning on doing it for next quarter. It's certainly a possibility. And the other part of what I wanted to mention is that, in each of our vendor individual reports, we do look at the industry verticals that the vendors play, and so the manufacturing industry is likewise covered in the individual reports, while we may not, summarize it in quite that extent in our actual benchmark.
Great. Our next question. What single vendor or group of vendors do you think is best positioned to capitalize on the C&SI inflection point and fuel long-term growth?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mentioned IBM, and I'm inclined to say I think IBM is up there. Really any vendor who has been out in front in terms of building the consulting and systems integration footprint has an advantage, and I think it's largely attributed to the people focus that we see in this market, particularly as it shifts from sort of implementation and integration and a focus on IT cost takeout to business value, and really at that inflection point where I see as generating business value is being able to bring to bear that industry-specific expertise. So IBM comes to mind, Accenture, any of the providers that have the industry-specific expertise, because the portfolio ultimately will be table stakes to competitiveness through alliances and acquisitions. Vendors will invest in those technology capabilities to meet demand, but really being able to deliver business value, being able to advise on an industry-specific basis and have the people that do that is the source of advantage, and that's where I see IBM as sort of standing out as ahead of the curve at this stage of the game.
Okay, next question. You discussed at length both the portfolio and personnel implication of long-term shifts in the C&SI market. Which of these do you think is more important from a vendor investment perspective, and why? Yeah,
so I mean, it sort of dovetails to what I was talking about with IBM, but I think it's going to start with the people, and if we speak specifically to creating business value, something like Watson is a really great technology, and it's really differentiated, but in the long term, it doesn't offer a lot of business value unless there's insight behind it, and particularly as analytics is adopted on a large scale basis, and as we showed before, as customers get buried under these increasing volumes of data and throw their hands up and yell for help, that help is going to come not only from providers who can offer the IT expertise to make that IT ecosystem burden easier to deal with, but those who can offer layer on top of that vertical specific expertise to deliver business value beyond just having the data, but what does it mean and how do we use it to achieve our outcomes? And that's something that's not only happening in consulting and systems integration, but if we look back to a few quarters ago where we covered during this webinar in detail the BPO industry, something that's happening there is vendors seek to add value and align BPO offerings to business requirements by blending core services with analytics and advisory capabilities to address business outcomes.
Thank you, and this will be our final question today. Are there other competitors not currently in the study that we should be worried about in this space?
Yeah, I think two come to mind, two groups, and one would be, and we talked a little bit about perhaps using different terminology, but in the management consulting space and some of the vendors that are gaining critical mass there, some of the big four firms who are aggressively investing in IT and technology consulting capabilities via acquisition. I think those firms, by virtue of having sort of a brand and mindshare advantage, as well as their expansive global scale, are going to increasingly impinge upon the space for some of the more technology-centric firms. And then on the other side, I'd say there's also an opportunity for smaller, more niche-oriented firms who have that deep vertical expertise I've been talking about, and perhaps through partnerships with larger systems integrators, are able to more effectively tailor analytics or mobility insights to address industry outcomes. And so I think those are two groups that will, as we continue to track this market as it proceeds toward the inflection point, I think those are two groups that will really see increasingly becoming competitive in the space.
Great. We've had a few other questions come in, so we're going to keep going. And how important are boutique, smaller consulting firms to customers in their strategic decision-making?
Well, that's an interesting question. Really depends on the firm themselves. I mean, and what the consulting firm targets and focuses on. I mean, if you're really if you're working for financial institutions and you're targeting and you do a lot of consulting in that space, certainly firms that help in that area and help customers, they are very important because they assist in the strategic process, and any assistance and guidance you can have from that perspective is critical. Yes, there are a number of firms that have gotten very good at being generalists across the board, cover a number of different industries, and certainly can do a lot of the work. There is still a need for strategic thinking and strategic decision making, as well as bringing in IT services and basically coming up and reconfiguring your infrastructure or figuring out what infrastructure is appropriate for your organization. So we have the whole management consulting industry that is focused on strategy. What should I do? Where should I do it? How should I operate? Which is, in a sense, and we look at it from our own perspective within TBR as a separate entity. It has a very important place in the overall consulting business. It certainly has different goals and objectives. We actually have an ongoing study that we produce on a semi-annual basis on just the strategy area and the management consulting area. To look at the various players who are somewhat different than the traditional IT services players. Some play in both sides of the market. Others strictly stick to the strategy side. So it is important. They do serve a different purpose than the IT services vendors that we actually cover in IT services benchmark.
Great. Thank you, Ramunas and Bryan. And thanks, everyone, for your questions. I'd like to encourage you to follow Ramunas and Bryan and TBR on Twitter at the handles provided, and to check out our SlideShare and YouTube pages for more information. As you're leaving the webinar, please take a moment to fill out a brief survey on the webinar. We'll be using your feedback to help improve our presentations from quarter to quarter. We'll leave the chat function open for another 5 minutes to give folks a chance to ask any last-minute questions. Thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.